Good evening, blog viewers. Today we'll cycle back to the virtue of freedom and authenticity, and it would seem that these virtues are never far apart. To the extent you cultivate the one virtue, freedom, it would seem you would necessarily cultivate the other, authenticity, and to the extent you have become authentic, you will have also established a well worked out, functioning, stable sense of freedom in your life that continues to build and build and build. So of course we have to think about what do we mean by authenticity. It's a word that is, I think, often used, and it's important to sort of specify what we mean by it first with as much clarity as we can. And to me, in terms of a human being, a person, authenticity means that the person is never is never a copy or imitation of anyone else in the universe. In one's core and central human attributes, actions, sort of manner of being. This person has not copied the path of anyone else, either before or since. Of course, to some extent, we all know this. We must all sort of copy one another in how we go about doing certain mundane tasks of everyday living. Things like filling up our car with gas, placing an envelope in the mail, ordering food at a drive-thru. These are things that we all copy and copy each other in how we do these things. There's no need to be authentic in how we do these things. But of course, these are all very insignificant acts. A person can be authentic while still copying how other people perform, sort of these daily insignificant actions of life. But a person can't be authentic if any sort of great majority of their actions or thoughts or even hopes for the future, sort of things they dream about, are more or less commonly shared, either by a large group, a nation, a society, whatever it is. That would be inconsistent at a deep level with being an authentic person. And an important point to bring out here: authenticity is sometimes viewed as always a positive thing, but I think a person can be inauthentic. A person can be not at all pursuing the virtue of authenticity while still being a very good, decent person. I don't think that the two are in conflict. A person can be a very good, decent person while still following the examples and imitations and lifestyles of other people. And I don't see a tension there. And conversely, a person, I think, can be very authentic and very true to their unique self, while being not a decent person, someone that is selfish, slimy, someone that no one would want to be friends with. I think that can happen also as well. And I think that will come out more as we go through the post. Now, generally, I think most of us and most people believe that they are more authentic than they really are. I think we all like to think we are special in some way, that we are, in fact, being authentic. And I think this is often a form of self-deception. I think we are all likely not aware of the many ways in which we are copying the example of others, not just in the insignificant actions of life, but extending far beyond it. And so I think perfect authenticity is probably never attainable for a human being. There are, beyond even the insignificant actions, there's likely things that we're doing all the time that we don't quite, just because of the limitations of our self-observance and our self-critical faculties, we're not really aware. I think we can never reach sort of perfect awareness of the ways we are copying other people. And so I think perfect authenticity is, like many of the other virtues, sort of perhaps viewed on a 0 to 100 scale. Some people are very close to 0, others are closer to 100, but no one reaches 100. And in general, and we should think for each of these virtues, whether it is better to be near 0, whether it's better to be near 100, and more importantly, whether it's worth the effort to be moving toward 100. Rather than saying, no one's going to reach 100, so there's no point even in trying. Now, why is authenticity, if it is to be viewed as a good thing, which we'll get into further, why would this be viewed as, why is this so difficult to achieve for so many people? And I think that answer has to incorporate in some way, shape, or form a response that authenticity is usually directly in conflict with practical success in many walks of life. Being practically successful in many different fields, not just one or two professional fields, but in many, many different fields, requires one to follow many standard conventions that have been laid down and established and refined by other people. And these conventions include not only how to speak, how to dress, how to write, how to think, what one should desire as good, what goals one should have, but even things beyond that I can't think of right now. But these include many, many conventions of how to properly succeed in a given field. Now, there's a very small group of people that are paid by certain companies or have certain careers where they can just innovate and constantly innovate, and their innovation requires them to be truly authentic. Perhaps certain singers or artists, or perhaps there are certain directors, Woody Allen, someone like that. But those are rare. Those are very rare instances. Most people, most walks of life, most jobs have no resemblance to that kind of life, and they require daily, habitual, almost hourly imitation in imitation and copying of what are standard conventions to succeed. And if practical success requires those things, then we have to think about what usually results with practical success. What are sort of the things that are associated with practical success? And those, of course, are typically money, power, and reputation. Those are the things that flow from becoming successful practically in many walks of life. And not only money, power, and reputation flow from it, but whatever money, power, and reputation can further obtain for us of many different sorts. And so these are things, money, power, reputation, that almost everyone thinks is good, almost without a limit. Many, many people think the more money, the more power, the more reputation one has, the more fame. That's the more one attains of those things, the more one's life has gone well. That is a successful, good life. And if there's any limits to how we've attained these things, or to the extent that we've obtained these things, our life will be better if we can rise beyond those limits and achieve more of those things. So many people then, someone that views money, power, reputation, and practical success as a good thing, which is in fact most to nearly all people, they would gladly trade a little authenticity or some of their authentic self for these various things that many people believe are unconditionally good. And this is sort of, I think, a key point. This would be a good trade, trading one's authenticity for these things, if in fact things like wealth, money, power, fame, reputation, all those things, if those things were as good as most people thought they were, if they were unconditionally good, or had a lot of goodness to them that is clear and unmistakable, and if they in fact promoted some form of human happiness and human flourishing. But it would be a very poor trade, and would be a very bad trade if those things were not unconditionally good, or not good for specific people, because then one's lost out on the cultivation of oneself, an authentic personality, for things that are at best neutral, or at worst pretty bad, and that is not a good trade. And now, to gain more insight on all these issues, we're going to turn again to Nietzsche. As Nietzsche again talked, I think we've talked about him in several of the other posts. His ideas on self-creation and authenticity deserve very, very serious attention. As we said previously, one reason was because his temporal proximity to us, writing in the late 1800s, and also the similar culture that he was writing in late 19th century Europe, and the similarities to today's culture are clearly there. While of course there's a lot of technological and other differences that have happened, but there are certain dominant values and tendencies that Nietzsche was able to observe that perhaps people like Plato and Aristotle did not see to the same extent or in their same permutations. So Nietzsche, and returning again to start out with his, we're going to look at Untimely Meditations today. And interestingly, Untimely Meditations was a book that Nietzsche wrote. Like many of his other works, he thought that his ideas were probably far too, would not be accepted at the time. So that's why I guess he labeled his work Untimely Meditations. But there would come a time when people had sort of developed their thinking on things, and his ideas would become more accepted and more understandable to many people. And I think to some extent that's happened, but still I think it's far from an age where Nietzsche's ideas would be accepted by more than any small minority of people. So I think to some extent the rest of the ideas we'll talk about from Nietzsche today are still untimely meditations. But returning to this trait conception we were just discussing, for Nietzsche, authenticity, the cultivation of one's true unique self, and the attainment of lasting freedom from doing that sort of thing should never be traded for anything else. For Nietzsche, nothing in the world could be as good, as pure, as beautiful as the cultivation and perfection of one's true genius that lied within one's sort of inner being. And whatever that genius was, and wherever the pursuit of that genius would lead us, nothing else could have anywhere close to the value of that kind of development of self, that it would at all be sensible for Nietzsche to make that sort of trade. The whole notion for Nietzsche that someone would give up or barter certain dimensions of their self in order to become something that one is not. For example, a doctor, a lawyer, a businessman, a politician, an actor, a singer, whatever the thing may be that one is sort of looking out into the future and seeking to become. The notion that one would give up on one's personality or individual uniqueness in order to become one of those things, that was for Nietzsche a very poor trade. And I want to read a passage where this becomes very clear in Nietzsche's second essay in Untimely Meditations, Schopenhauer as Educator. Nietzsche writes here, "This eternal becoming something is a lying puppet show in which man has forgot himself. It is the force that scatters individuality to the four winds, the eternal childish game that the big baby time is playing in front of us and with us. The heroism of sincerity lies in ceasing to be the plaything of time. Everything in the process of becoming is a hollow sham, contemptible and shallow. Man can only find the solution of his riddle in being something definite and unchangeable." So Nietzsche contrasts here the desire to become something with the desire to be what one is already right now, and be that self that one is right now, and just display it and perfect it, rather than trying to become something that sort of lies outside the self, that doesn't correspond with what's internal in the self, and what sort of internally we know is our sort of true love and true genius, whatever the term may be, true unique capabilities. And beyond what's in that passage, Nietzsche, I think, believed this because he believed that life only gained any meaning, life gained any sort of lasting happiness when we became, in his words, our own true pilots, when we answered the question of why we existed in the first place, when we lived after, and this is again to quote Nietzsche, after our own rule and measure. Each person, Nietzsche thought, and this was sort of important to Nietzsche's ideas here, each person in the world that's ever existed and that ever will exist had sort of was a unique marvel, Nietzsche thought, as a unique, beautiful and interesting subject, he says, a new and incredible phenomenon that could never become boring or tedious as long as it continued to perfect and develop its sort of singular core dimension of authentic personality. There is no one Nietzsche thought before or since that will ever be quite like the person you are right now, and no one will have sort of that that uniqueness that you have, and therefore developing that and cultivating that was the only thing, or one of the only things, that I think for Nietzsche gave life any of its meaning, any of its purpose, any of its happiness, any of its joy. And on the other hand, as soon as one, I think Nietzsche was very clear on this, and very, not only very dogmatic, but very absolutist on this point. As soon as one, literally the second that one abandoned living in this kind of way, living the authentic lifestyle, living a life where one is cultivating the unique aspects of the self, then one when one, in Nietzsche's terms, begins to live and think according to what he calls second-hand learning, second-hand action, and second-hand thought, Nietzsche thought life became very, very spiritless and weak and very dull. The second that happened, the second we turned the back on the self. Now, Nietzsche, unlike some of the other thinkers that we've been looking at, does not set forth arguments in the same way that Aristotle does in the Ethics, or Plato, of course, wrote in Dialogues, but in many other philosophers. He often doesn't really prove in the same way what he's saying or his assertions, and I think that's probably a flaw in his philosophy, that his assertions are often very grand and very inspiring and eloquent, but they're not, for all of that, they're still not proven at all. But I think it would go too far to say Nietzsche doesn't set forth arguments to support some of his conclusions. He doesn't do them in the same way Aristotle does, with sort of all tightly packed in one section. But if you read Nietzsche's texts closely enough, you'll find throughout them various ideas and scattered phrases or scattered joints of ideas, fragments of ideas that actually support larger ideas that he introduces, larger conclusions that he asserts later. And on this point of why life would lose its meaning when one imitated, or why imitation is always bad for the self, Nietzsche actually, in Untimely Meditations, puts forth, I think, two pretty good reasons for why imitation is always bad for the self, whatever else results from it. And he says that whenever we play any sort of part, we always play it sort of badly and superficially. Sort of an interesting thought, that every imitation is bound to result in some sort of failure of some sort or another, because we can only imitate superficially and therefore badly. Every imitation, I think Nietzsche is trying to say here, is an attempt to be like the original, whatever the original was. The original lawyer, the original composer, the original, Michael Jackson, the original song artist. Every imitation is an attempt to reach that original personality or original being. And that attempt will always fail. Every imitative attempt will always fail, Nietzsche thinks. Whereas when we act from the core of ourself, the argument, if you extend it out, we will perform much better because we are the original, so we can't fail we can't fail in the attempt to be ourselves. There is sort of a 100% equivalence between who we are and how we are acting in that sense. We can't fail to be the original self that we are. People may not like it, people may, we may end up not even liking it, but we still can't fail in the attempt to display our authenticness. That will at least be a genuine being, rather than sort of, as Nietzsche says, a failed bad play. And secondly, imitation for Nietzsche always required following the past, some past model, some past figure, and the past always was imperfect, and past practices always had a large amount of human error and human imperfection contained with them. So when we imitate various models, whether in the past or even in the present, we're imitating things that are imperfect, we are imitating things that are filled with error, and therefore whatever errors they have, we're going to be imbibing them and including them within ourselves, making them part of our personality, and therefore imitation for that reason is bad for the self under Nietzsche's account. Beyond what he perceived as the pernicious influence or the pernicious desire to want to, quote, become something that one is not. Nietzsche thought that forcing one's personality to fit within the contours of whatever one sought to become was very, very likely to happen in modern times because of several of the reasons I think that we mentioned, but several other reasons Nietzsche brings out. And Nietzsche saw many forces at play, many forces operating on modern man that sort of crippled his freedom to actually be himself. The first thing that Nietzsche brings out is men are caught up in various distractions of one sort or another. Distractions like following a sports team, following politics, the stock market, TV shows, whatever it may be. These things are not bad again, but if all we're doing is sort of following these things, we're always following things that are outside of ourselves, whether to call it a distraction or not, whatever term you want to use, it's fundamentally an interest in a thing that is outside of oneself, and therefore distracts one from the process of locating authentic being that would then be the basis of freedom, and then would be the basis of sort of the happiness that Nietzsche thinks is so likely to come when we do this. Second, man sort of, in Nietzsche's views, pursued comfort too aggressively, achieved comfort, and then became sort of lazy and sort of rested and stopped with whatever comfort he had achieved in life and just sort of wanted to preserve it. This sort of person just sort of enjoys whatever comfort they've achieved. They become lazy. When one becomes lazy, again, the authenticity of the self sort of withers away. There's no effort to bring that out. There's no working to bring that out. It just sort of languishes there while one is sort of resting, very comfortable. Sort of, I think, in the Epicurean model. I think we sort of discussed this point last time when we talked about the Epicurean philosophy of life. There's no effort to rise beyond sort of whatever one is or whatever one enjoys, the comforts or the distractions or amusements that one enjoys. And so that was another reason why people, Nietzsche thought, didn't pursue in the right ways, in the very serious ways that he thought was important, their authenticity. And then there was a certain clinging that Nietzsche sort of attacked, a certain clinging to things that impede the self from developing and reaching sort of a mature perfection. Nietzsche asks, why cling to your bit of earth or your little business or listen to what your neighbor says? It is so provincial to bind oneself to views which are no longer binding a couple of 100 miles away. It's an important thought, I think. For Nietzsche, we can extrapolate from this. The self could be developed and perfected if the self could be developed and perfected, if we could develop authenticity and develop our authentic self by moving somewhere else, by giving up even a profitable business that was not our true love of life or love to life, or thing that we really was formed the authentic core of our being. If we had to refuse to sort of uncritically accept the values and beliefs of everyone around us just to sort of fit in, those were all things that there was no question in Nietzsche's mind that one should do that. One should move elsewhere. One should give up on a business that was profitable. One should refuse to uncritically accept the values of everyone around us, if these things impeded the development of that authentic self. Again, there was no question in Nietzsche's mind that these things should be prized. Strike that. So there was no question in Nietzsche's mind that those things should never be prized above the cultivation of the authentic self. And therefore the person would necessarily have to make difficult choices, give up on things that he enjoys in order to continue to develop the self in the ways that Nietzsche prized. Now, instead of getting caught up in these sorts of dead ends, what Nietzsche praised was a life where, again, we are locating a strong virtue within ourselves and developing that virtue fully, perhaps to the detriment of other virtues. And this was, I think, for Nietzsche, the project of locating authenticity in the self was almost 100% opposed and different than Aristotle's idea of sort of locating a mean state across all the virtues and sort of placing oneself in the middle of each virtue, as Aristotle thought that was the most important thing. Aristotle didn't prize self-creation and self-authenticity, but prized locating the mean in terms of human action and human human virtues, and just finding that mean relative to ourselves, of course, but still never straying too far from the mean of what was appropriate for a human being across all the different virtues. Nietzsche had a very different view. He writes in Untimely Meditations here, the teacher, he's talking about a teacher that's working with a student, the teacher should find out at once the strong point in his pupil, and then direct all his skill and will, all the moisture and all the sunshine, to bring the fruit of that single virtue to maturity. So if one had one virtue that really formed the authentic dimension of one's personality, that was the virtue that Nietzsche thought should be perfected and pursued and brought into its full splendor. In this sense, I think Nietzsche was not at all a fan of sort of a modern approach of sort of dabbling in a lot of different activities, trying sort of surfing one day, painting the next, gardening the day after that, maybe even reading a little philosophy on the side, these books in the bookstore, Nietzsche in 20 minutes or whatever. He was not a fan of that at all. He thought that was sort of a life where no virtue was perfected. Nothing was ever strengthened and pursued to its sort of best point. And sort of one was left sort of feeble in the end, sort of dabbling around in all these virtues, but never perfecting any of them. And he thought the same thing about knowledge and things we sought to learn. He didn't believe that people should dabble in knowledge. Nietzsche, if authenticity resided in sort of our intellectual faculties, Nietzsche didn't think that we should just dabble in all these sorts of knowledge, but would rather encourage people to really pursue deep knowledge, looking for knowledge that really furthered the ends of life and the deepest needs of a human being, the deepest concerns of a human being, the most important problems of a human being that need to be worked out. That sort of knowledge was for him the one of most value that we should try to pursue, and that is the knowledge that he thought would, in the end, allow us to develop our uniqueness. Now, interestingly, for a philosopher, Nietzsche actually has some fairly straightforward advice as to how we can actually, all of this discussion about locating the individual uniqueness is someone could say, oh, it's great, but how do you find that? How do you locate that uniqueness? Where is it? And Nietzsche actually has a pretty good ideas on this, and he has a pretty straightforward statement on Timely Meditation as to how we are to do that, and I want to read it at length because it's pretty powerful. He's I think this is in the essay Schopenhauer as Educator, and Nietzsche writes here. One second. This is the most effective way to let the youthful soul look back on life with the question, what hast thou up to now truly loved? Let me read that again. This is the most effective way to let the youthful soul look back on life with the question, what hast thou up to now truly loved? What has drawn thy soul upward? Mastered it and blessed it too. Set up these things that thou hast honored before thee, and maybe they will show thee in their being and their order a law which is the fundamental law of thine own self. Compare these objects, consider how one completes and broadens and transcends and explains another, how they form a ladder on which thou hast all the time been climbing to thyself. For thy true being lies not deeply hidden in thee, but an infinite height above thee, or at least above that which thou dost commonly take to be thyself. So for Nietzsche, very importantly, the uniqueness of our being, or that authentic core, resides in what we love, in what we truly love. Not we love for what it can bring, what other things it can bring, but what is it that fundamentally that we love for its own self, for its own sort of goodness. And that is the thing that what is the thing that has sort of uplifted our spirit or uplifted our soul? What is the thing that has given us sort of a feeling of the blessedness of life, or the natural goodness of life? what are those activities, or what are those thoughts, or what are those maybe other persons, whatever it is, what are those things that have that we've truly loved? Those are the things that we should form or look to locate our individual being. And once we find those things, we will see that we still have very high, very far to go to reach them in their completeness, and we should try as much as we can to perfect them and continue to rise up to them. So Nietzsche here makes the point, and he makes the point differently in another place, that the thing that is authentic has to be something we truly love. He says somewhere else in Untimely Meditations, don't try to be an artist if that's not your real strength. Don't try to force yourself to be just if you don't actually pursue being just and sort of being a public-spirited, public-minded, community service-oriented person. If that is not what you love, then that's not your authentic self, no matter how good it may be for other people or how good that the activity is in itself. That those are not the things. And in whatever we locate that thing to be, don't imitate anyone else, even in the manner in which you actually go about trying to bring about your individual uniqueness. Even if the uniqueness is individual, Nietzsche still sort of condemned any effort to sort of imitate other people in how we're sort of bringing about that perfection. So I think we can see that Nietzsche's thoughts on freedom and authenticity are in some ways pretty surprising and shocking. They sort of fly in the face of how a lot of decent, non-philosophically inclined people sort of act all the time, sort of how they operate in the world, what they value, and so and more importantly, how they sort of trade off one thing against another. I think most people would not at all agree with Nietzsche that the self should be prized to an extent where one should give up on all these other things that one is pursuing in life, goods of reputation, power, wealth, even good opinion in society, even good social relationships, friendships, all of those things. I don't think most people would agree with Nietzsche on that. So what do we make of these ideas? And so I think Nietzsche diagnoses a problem that is very real in modern society. I think to some extent, or to a great extent, imitation in current times has gone haywire. The needs of the self, I think, have been largely abandoned, whether because of laziness or the pursuit of comfort or lack of courage, whatever the reason may be. But I think in general, he diagnosed and accurately the problem of imitation, the extent to which imitation is driving people, the extent to which the needs of the self have been totally ignored, totally misconceived in sort of misguided ways, and the detriment and the problem that happens, and the weakening of life, and the weakening of the spirit, and the weakening of the soul that happens when those things happen. And he actually gives some well thought out reasons as to why, I think his ideas as to why we shouldn't imitate, and what is sort of the feebleness of the attempt to imitate, and sort of self-defeating nature of it. I think those ideas are actually pretty well thought out too. And he also has some good ideas, I think, on how to actually locate what it is within the self that is actually best to be located as sort of the authentic center of freedom and authentic center of human uniqueness that we all have. But still, I think Nietzsche's thoughts, now of course a relic of the past, suffers from some imperfections that he himself pointed out, existed in all past thought. He made the point that all sort of past thought or past thinking of the world had some imperfection, and of course now I think to some extent we could say his thought has some imperfections in it as well. Three main ones I was able to identify, probably more, but I think three important ones that sort of could probably in some ways refine Nietzsche's ideas and improve them. Nietzsche condemns the imitation of the past because he thinks the past is filled with errors. one of the reasons. But the present is also filled with errors, and there's no assurance that someone cultivating their sort of inner genius will not make any errors, that there's no errors in the self. How often have we seen someone who starts out with sort of the good-intentioned effort to cultivate his own uniqueness become literally a lunatic, become someone that's incapable of functioning as even a decent human being, let alone a virtuous or perfected one. So I think in that sense, if the critique is that we shouldn't imitate others because they're filled with error, I think strictly bringing out the self, strictly developing the self, strictly prizing the self is no less likely to be filled with his own errors, because no human being is perfect. No human being achieves perfection just by developing his self. But there has to be something more there. There has to be something looking over the self. There has to be something critiquing the self. There has to be something finding the right balance there between what the self is trying to do and just the demands of decent living with other people, and the demands of decent interactions with other people, and decent respect for other people. And I don't think Nietzsche strikes the right balance. Nietzsche, second point, Nietzsche sort of exaggerates various points in dangerous ways. It's probably true that no one can cultivate one's unique self other than oneself. But I don't think it follows that other people can't assist you in some way, shape, or form in the process of developing yourself in sort of minor ways, lending you a helping hand, sharing insights and feedback that you can actually use in a way to bring your unique self out. Nietzsche is sort of totally dismissive of this possibility. The self for Nietzsche, as we saw, had to be created strictly by one's own efforts, by sort of the hard, laborious task of sort of cultivating the singular virtue in oneself and sort of bringing it out. Had to be done by the self. He talks about being a wanderer by himself, going into the desert, living alone. Again, it's this radical individualism in Nietzsche's philosophy, and I don't think he gets it right. I don't think he gets it totally right. The self, I think he's right to say that the self has to largely, well, he doesn't say this, but I think it's right to say, the self largely has to be created by one's own efforts, by one's own cultivation, by one's own sort of sweat. But I think we can certainly benefit from the guidance of other people and the input of others in that process, without at all detracting from the beauty or value of whatever self is ultimately constructed. So in that sense, I think the self can be largely created by one's own efforts, but assisted in sort of minor ways by other people that, or even imitation of other practices in ways that sort of still further the human being. I don't think Nietzsche was right to say the self had to strictly be done completely apart from any imitation, any assistance from other people. And I think, but while he was still right to say that largely the self had to be developed by oneself, and largely imitation should be avoided. Finally, I think the Nietzschean self that sort of achieved perfect authenticity and freedom has completely, in many ways, has abandoned sort of the mean state of humanity. It's interesting to ask if Nietzsche's sort of perfected self would be able to have any friends. Would he be able to have any relations with people that were not interested in the same things he were, just for whatever reason? They were just interested in other things, not philosophy, not self-perfection, not any of those things. We're just totally interested in other activities. And I think the Nietzschean self, or the self that he prizes, just continues going further and further away from the dominant practices of his time in order to pursue his sort of individual genius. Now, maybe for a few rare geniuses, would be a great thing, a great artist, or something like that, but it's probably not the right philosophy for most people. And in the end, human beings are social creatures, as Aristotle correctly pointed out. We have to maintain some contact with what's called the genotype. In biology, there's this sort of the concept of the genotype and the phenotype. I think we all have to maintain some contact with the genotype of the human species, the essential, normal form that a human being has assumed, that human life has assumed over many thousands of years. We can't completely fly from the genotype. But of course, the phenotypes, the sort of the individual expression of ourself, the individual amplification and development and particularization of the self, behaviors of the self, thoughts of the self, goals of the self, all those things are very important to pursue and very important to cultivate. But I think it's important that the phenotype expression and the uniqueness and the authenticity and the freedom be cultivated in ways that does not destroy the genotype, does not destroy contact with the genotype. It's important to maintain contact with the genotype and not make a fetish out of self-creation or freedom or any of these things, or authenticity, to the extent that one loses contact with that sort of generic form. And I don't think Nietzsche took that idea seriously, and I don't think he struck the right balance on that point. So I think Nietzsche's ideas in the end on these issues serve more as sort of a form of literary inspiration than as any worked out rational philosophical approach to life. I think his ideas can perhaps be used by someone to get going on the quest to actually develop a unique self, someone that had sort of neglected that project entirely or almost entirely for many, many years. I think I think a poet, the American poet Hart Crane, once said that when he read Emerson, who wrote about many similar issues and wrote in ways similar to Nietzsche, you could almost say Emerson was America's Nietzsche. The poet Hart Crane once said that when he read Emerson, he was brought to a boil, and he was able to then produce his best work once he moved beyond Nietzsche's ideas. But that sort of inspired in him that energy. And I think in the same way, Nietzsche's ideas can sort of serve as the initial energy and quest to get going on the creation of a self. But I don't think his ideas can be pursued to their end point in a responsible way. And I think probably it's best that when one gets going on this effort to create an authentic self, that at some point, or fairly quickly actually, one cycle out of Nietzsche's sort of philosophies of life into one that probably balances the needs of the self and man's many other obligations and duties a bit better than what Nietzsche did. So I think while Nietzsche was right to point out very important tensions between man's happiness, the creation of a unique self, and the pursuit of reason, but the ways that the ways in which he resolved that tension between those things violate the requirements of reason too strongly to be fully accepted, I think, in their entirety. So with that, we'll end today's post. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.